This chapter is all dedicated to learning about styling and how we can style our components and how they work in terms of a component tree. We know that when we build components, we nest components inside of each other. I have our app component open, and inside we have our donut list component. So when I style this component, how does it flow, and how does CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, how does it react with our components? So before we go any further and dive into things such as control flow statements, where we're going to iterate and hide and show content based on particular conditions, we're going to make our application look a bit neater. So we can jump into our app component. We can then remove all the styles. So we'll give this a background of white, a nice border radius with a value of 8 pixels. Now, because we are developing to the right side of the screen, I'm going to keep a maximum width of 400 pixels because this fits in the window nicely. We can then add a fixed width of 94%. And what this will essentially mean is whatever the width of the browser is, there's going to be 3% each side to make up for that remaining 6% that we are not setting. And we'll have a look at this momentarily. Time for some margin and some padding. Let's add 25 pixels and auto, so we get some nice spacing top and bottom, and also some padding with 25 pixels. So we'll also add a border. I'm going to give this a value of 4 pixels solid, and the hex code for this is EF9, FC, and 7. We can hit save, and this looks a lot nicer already. If we then adjusted the browser width, this would then expand and collapse accordingly. Now, one thing that we are definitely missing is a header with a logo inside, so I'm going to add this. If we jump up into our template, we can add a header. We could, of course, create a header component, but for now, we just keep things nice and simple. We can say header class, and I always like to give these a separate class rather than targeting the elements themselves. And inside, we can create an image with a source attribute, some alt text, which will say Ultimate Donuts, and we'll finally give this a class name of logo. So inside of our source attribute, we want to look inside of our assets folder. We then have our image and then a logo file. We can then hit save, and we should see something like this. So we have a nice prepared logo, which I've already designed and included in the project for us. So this is our nice shop starting to take effect. So to give this a nice layout, let's create some header styles. Now for this, we're going to use some Flexbox, and we can use a nice justify dash content with a value of center and some margin bottom because we want to push down the main content block. So we're going to have 25 pixels. If we then save this out, we won't see any difference until we add our logo. We can set a width of 100 pixels and a height of 88 pixels. We can save things out and things are looking a bit more in proportion, apart from the components themselves. What I want to do is jump into the DOM and have a look at how these styles are being applied. From the top, we have our application root. So this is the container element. So when we declare this application root inside of our index file, this then essentially injects the content. So our next element will be our app, which we then have a div class of app. And you can see that Angular is given these ng host and ng content attributes with a random hash. Now this random hash, tby-c13, gets rebuilt every time we recompile. So if we hit save and then refresh, you can see that we have a different value here. Now this is done deliberately for cache busting reasons. When we recompile and upload a new version of our website or web application, we then have different style names. So it's going to then repaint and make sure that we're then forcing those new styles every single time. And you can see here that Angular is cleverly binding to our declaration. So even though we are specifying .header, we're not adding this attribute selector on top of things. Angular is doing that for us. What's also interesting is how Angular is injecting the styles into our application. If we go back to our elements, we can open up the head. We have a style block, and you can see inside of here that Angular is rendering it in the head, separate to the component itself. So this is interesting, and Angular is using this approach with a style tag instead of a CSS file. Now this approach is interesting because it allows us to have different components with the same class names. For instance, if we jumped into our donut card and added the class of logo and hit save, nothing is actually going to happen. even though we know the logo class exists. Now that is because the style is scoped to a particular component. So if we jump down into our header, again, we can have a look at our logo. You can see that we have logo, ng content, JYI-C13. Our donut card does not, because it's a different component, it does not inherit those particular styles. We also do not have any styles in our donut card. So that means if we were to then go and add some, you can see that Angular has now added a different hash. So here we have donut list, which inherits the same attribute, C13, and then we have donut card with C11. And that's just simply because I've added this empty string. So if we remove it, Angular's not going to add it. You can see when we hit refresh, we do not have any of these style attributes. So we'll leave it in there for now, just so we can see, and we'll go up and remove this logo. So this is nice because it means that we can adopt approaches, perhaps importing styles from a different library. And I'm very sure in the past that you've inherited some CSS from elsewhere and it's then conflicted with somewhere else in your application. So Angular's approach to handling our styles is in fact really nice, flexible, and it keeps things as simple as I think is possible. We have our class names for our donut card. However, we don't have any styles. So let's take our donut card class name and start adding some. We can choose a display flex with an align items value of center. We're then going to use a nice background. For this, we can use F7, 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 which is a nice light gray. We'll add some border radius with a value of 5 pixels. We want each card to be separate, so we're going to then add a margin bottom of 5 pixels. Padding just to give things some breathing space. We'll do 5 pixels and 15 pixels. We'll also add a nice transition property. We'll add this to the transform, and we can say 0.2 seconds, ease in and out. And as we hover over our particular component, so it gives us some nice user feedback. Now, a new feature in Angular, if we open up our angular.json, and this is something that I've been looking forward to, is having Sass support, which is a more powerful CSS styling language, which allows us to nest our selectors instead of typing them out long form each time. We also have this new property, inline style language. So this is fairly new in Angular, and this allows us to use the power of Sass inside of our components. Before this change, we would have to do donut card and then hover and then specify those styles. However, we can just take this hover and we can simply inherit the name. So we can say, and when we hover, we want to then apply a transform, and we're going to use a simple translate of Y, passing in -3 pixels. So when we save this out, we can check it out in the browser. You can see that we have a nice little card with a light gray background that just ever so slightly moves upon hovering. So let's add some styles for the rest of our component. We have this dash name. You can see that we have donut card icon, donut card name, and price. So what we're going to do is add styles for those. In the same way that we can inherit and essentially extend a style by using ampersand, we can also do the same with class names. So we don't have to type donut dash card dash name. We can simply inherit the prefix and then bind a nice dash name onto the end. So for this, we can say we want the font size to have a nice value of 16. We can then create a price, this slightly smaller because the title of the product is more important. We can then give it a different color as well. For this, we're going to use C14583 as the hex code. Finally, for the icon, at the moment, I think you'll agree it's far too large. So we can use dash icon, set a fixed width of 50 pixels with a margin right of 10 pixels just to push our text across. So saving this out gives us a much nicer looking UI. And eventually what we'll do is allow us to click on these and then route through to that particular component, make some changes, save things in a form, update things, whatever we want to do. And then we can navigate back to this home view of all of our products. Again, if we jump into our DOM elements in our browser, we can then see those different prefixes and how they change based on the particular components. So no styles are going to get conflicted. We've learned how to scope a style per a component. And we've also talked about this nice nesting feature with Sass. It's up to you how you want to write your styles. I personally prefer using Sass and just keeping things nice and simple and nesting them as such. Any styles that we want to add, we can add inside of this styles block. We can actually use a different property should we wish, and that would involve using this style URLs. What this would then do is replace our styles array, and we would then move this style into its own file. Personally, I prefer to have everything in one file. It keeps our code base nice and clean. And we also have the benefit of using some code folding, so we can actually hide the styles if we want, so we can access our template much easier. So with that in mind, I think we're ready to proceed with the next lesson. We've covered our application styling, we've covered our single component styling, and these styles then get applied for every single component. We've also talked about how those styles get injected in some style tags. So each component will render its own style tag. We have our app header and the logo. And then in here, we have our donut card, which is then injecting those styles. And you can see how our Sass is then being extended out and printed out with that prefix, as well as the ng content that Angular is generating. So that's an introduction to styling with Angular. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about something called a host element. And we briefly touched upon it on here. However, I'm going to show you some magical selectors that allow us to target our host.